In August 1944, a group of German women soldiers left their homeland for a place they could hardly imagine. They had been told that surrender meant captivity, but what captivity would truly look like was a question no one could answer. Rumors had traveled fast, tales of harsh treatment, of hunger, of relentless Allied discipline. Many expected a prison with cold walls and constant surveillance. Some feared outright cruelty. Others clung to hope that at least their basic needs would be met. They traveled in trucks, along roads pocked with dust and gravel, moving away from familiar villages and towns. Each step into the unknown carried a mixture of fear and disbelief. In diaries from that time, one woman wrote simply, "I do not know what awaits, only that it must be worse than I can imagine." Another noted the silence in the air, an oppressive quiet that seemed to press against them as they left everything behind. For many of these young women, most in their late teens or early 20s, life in the military had already been harsh. They had been trained to obey, to endure long marches, cold nights, and scarce food. Yet the thought of crossing the sea, of entering a foreign land where they would be prisoners, introduced an entirely new kind of tension. The journey was long, and their minds were restless. Some spoke little, staring out the windows at the fields passing by. Others whispered to friends, asking questions that had no answers. The journey itself was a mix of routine and uncertainty. Guards watched carefully, but the women's thoughts were elsewhere. They wondered about the people they would meet, the buildings they would live in, the food they would eat, or not eat. Letters from home had been scarce, and even when they came, they were filled with worry rather than reassurance. One letter read, "Do not fear too much, but I cannot tell you what is coming." When the transport reached the coast, the women were guided onto a ship that would take them across the channel. For many, this was their first time seeing the water so wide, so restless. Waves pounded against the hull, and the smell of salt filled the air. The sea made the journey feel endless. In letters written after their return, several women recalled staring at the horizon for hours, each glance a silent prayer, each thought a question about the life awaiting them on the other side. Arriving in Britain, the first sights were strangely orderly. Soldiers moved with precision, buildings were clean, roads were well kept. Some of the women, trained to see disorder as danger, found this almost suspicious. How could a place so calm hold them as prisoners? They expected shouting, barking orders, the clang of metal gates. Instead, there was quiet. A camp was waiting for them, fenced and guarded, but calm in a way that was entirely unfamiliar. Their first steps into the camp were cautious. Each footfall echoed differently. Each movement felt exposed. Some held their heads high, trying to maintain dignity. Others kept their eyes down, hearts pounding with the tension of uncertainty. In diaries, one woman wrote, "I expected to be struck, yet no one even looked at me sharply. I did not know whether to relax or to run." The camp routines began immediately, but slowly. They were assigned sleeping quarters, shown washing areas, and guided toward mess halls. Everything was explained with courtesy. Guards spoke with calm voices. Meals were scheduled, clothes were provided, beds made. This order was striking to the women, who had been trained to expect the opposite. One diary entry captured the feeling. "We are not beaten. We are not shouted at. It is as if someone has taken away the fear itself, but replaced it with confusion." Even the food caused unease. A table with bread, porridge, and fresh vegetables seemed almost unimaginable. Many of the women had spent weeks surviving on meager rations. To see abundance, yet feel unsure whether they could touch it freely, created a quiet, creeping disbelief. Some hesitated. Hands hovered over bowls, eyes darted to the guards. "It feels wrong," wrote one woman, "to be offered so much, and yet to know we are captives." As days passed, small routines began to form. Roll calls, cleaning duties, and supervised walks in the open campgrounds. The women observed everything carefully, measuring their new world against the one they had known. Letters and diaries revealed that their minds were constantly active, processing not just their own reactions, but also those of their fellow prisoners. Some were relieved, some were angry, most were unsure. One entry read, We look at each other and cannot speak. The fear remains, but it is different now. It is silent, almost hollow. Despite the calm, anticipation lingered. Each woman knew that the war was still raging and that their home country faced destruction and loss. Every day carried news from distant radio broadcasts, letters smuggled in, whispers from the few who had arrived earlier. Their minds replayed images of their towns, their families, the front lines. And yet, in this strange, quiet camp, those memories felt distant, almost unreal. Preparations for work inside the camp began. Some were assigned kitchens, laundry, or small maintenance tasks. None involved combat, but each was unfamiliar. The women observed their surroundings, taking note of every detail. The way the guards walked, the layout of buildings, the smell of freshly baked bread, the texture of clean sheets. Every moment was processed, compared, and judged against the expectations they had carried from Germany. Evenings were the hardest. Lights dimmed, rooms were filled with hushed conversations or quiet sobs. Some women wrote letters they could not send. Others simply stared at walls, replaying memories of home, of battlefields, of a life left behind. In diaries, they often admitted the same feeling, that of being caught between worlds. They were prisoners, yet treated almost as guests. They were strangers, yet watched closely. They were afraid, yet confused by the lack of expected cruelty. One recurring observation appears again and again. The sheer calm of the British camp was disorienting. In Germany, they had been trained to see the enemy as relentless, brutal, and unforgiving. The reality they faced was different. The guards' patience, the clean beds, the steady routines, all of it challenged every assumption they had carried. One woman wrote, "We were told the Allies would punish us. We feared their hands, their voices, their eyes. Instead, they looked at us as if we were not dangerous at all." The first few weeks passed slowly. The women began to notice small things. Flowers planted along the camp paths, sunlight on the grass, the distant laughter of children in nearby villages. It was impossible to reconcile these gentle images with the war they had known. Each moment of calm forced reflection, sometimes fear, sometimes awe. They learned to move carefully, speak cautiously, but also to observe deeply. Even as routines became familiar, the anticipation of what was coming next never fully disappeared. Each letter, each rumor, each minor change in schedule was noted. They were constantly measuring their world, their expectations, and their fears. The diaries reveal a mixture of hope and anxiety. Hope for survival, for the war's end, for eventual return home. Anxiety over unknown rules, the behavior of guards, and the reactions of fellow prisoners. By the end of the first month, the women had begun to form a quiet rhythm of life. They knew the camp, its layout, its schedules, and its routines. Yet they had not yet reconciled the dissonance between what they expected and what they experienced. Their minds remained alert, watching, measuring, anticipating. And in that space of silent observation, their greatest challenge was not physical, it was understanding the strange, calm reality that surrounded them. The arrival, the first meals, the quiet supervision, the strange abundance, these were all small shocks that slowly built in their minds. They were not prepared for it. No story told at home, no rumor of Allied cruelty, no expectation of prison hardship could have prepared them for the subtle, disorienting calm of captivity. And so, as August turned to September, these young women lived in a world that seemed almost gentle, yet carried an unspoken tension. They had arrived as prisoners, but their minds were prisoners too, caught between fear and disbelief, expectation and reality, war and peace. The first chapter of their story in Britain had begun. The quiet calm that greeted the German women in Britain did not last long. What followed was a reality far more complex than anything they had imagined. Daily life in the camp unfolded slowly, but each moment carried its own subtle surprises. For these young women, trained to expect danger, cruelty, and chaos, the ordinary rhythms of British camp life became a source of profound shock. Meals remained the first and most vivid revelation. Tables were laid with simple but generous portions: fresh bread, butter, vegetables, and warm stews. For women who had known weeks of hunger, each bite was both relief and confusion. Hands trembled over food. Eyes scanned the room, expecting someone to shout, to reprimand, to enforce scarcity. But no one did. One diary reads, "I sat frozen. There was so much. I could take more than I dared. I could eat, and yet I felt guilty for doing so." Another wrote, "The smell of the food made my stomach ache with disbelief. We were not starving. We were free in a strange way." The camp itself was organized and surprisingly humane. Buildings were clean and well-maintained. Beds had sheets. Bathrooms were hot and functional. Guards were present but not oppressive. Each interaction with them was measured, calm, almost polite. The women could not reconcile this with the propaganda they had been fed in Germany. Their training had painted a picture of Allied cruelty, yet the reality was different. In letters smuggled back to Germany, several wrote simply, "We do not understand this. There is no fear, no anger, only quiet. And still, we are prisoners." Daily routines were another surprise. Tasks were assigned: laundry, kitchen work, cleaning, but always in a structured, predictable way. There was no hurry, no yelling, no punishment for minor mistakes. One woman wrote, "I kept expecting the punishment for slowness, but none came. I could take my time. I could breathe." The calm, measured pace of life unsettled them as much as the meals or the clean beds. They had been trained for conflict, to expect challenge at every turn. Now the challenge was internal: to trust, to relax, to accept that the rules of this world were different. Walks outside the camp were both a relief and a shock. British countryside stretched quietly beyond the fences. Trees, flowers, and open fields were almost surreal. Birds sang, villagers went about daily tasks. Nothing here resembled the images they had been fed of a world ruled by relentless enemies. One diary reflected, "We walked past cottages and farms. People waved. We froze. How could they wave to us, the enemy?" The women also observed their fellow prisoners closely. Some had arrived weeks earlier, others months before. These women had begun to adapt, yet each had their own method of coping. Some kept to themselves, writing endlessly in journals. Some spoke in hushed tones, sharing news from home. Others carefully watched the guards and routines, looking for hidden rules. Observing each other became a silent ritual, a way to measure reality, to check one's own perceptions. Sleep was another battleground of the mind. Even with beds and blankets, many struggled to rest. The quiet of the camp at night was unfamiliar, almost unsettling. One wrote, "I closed my eyes and imagined shouting, imagined punishment. Nothing came. I woke afraid of nothing, and that scared me most." Dreams were often filled with fragments of war, of home, of training exercises. Waking moments were equally fractured, as the mind tried to reconcile fear with calm, captivity with courtesy. Surprise visits from Red Cross representatives added another layer to the experience. They brought letters, small parcels, and news from the front. The women realized that the world outside the camp still existed, and that they were connected in ways they had not expected. One entry noted, "I held the letter from my mother and could not read it. Everything seemed distant and unreal, yet it was real. This was real, and I was here, alive and safe." Yet, even with calm and abundance, small tensions arose. Rules were simple but strict. Curfews were enforced. Smoking and certain conversations were monitored. The women quickly learned that freedom had boundaries. Disobedience was met not with violence, but with removal of privileges or careful reprimand. It was subtle, yet effective. One woman wrote, "We learned to move like shadows, to speak softly, to obey without fear, because fear was not needed." Psychological shock became a daily companion. The women were forced to rethink everything they had believed about the enemy, about captivity, about survival. The calmness, the kindness, and the order were not expected. They had been trained to see the world as harsh, violent, and black and white. The British camp existed in gray space, controlled yet humane, organized yet gentle. Diaries repeatedly mentioned the same word, disbelief. "I cannot believe this is real," wrote one. Another, "We are prisoners, yet I feel almost free." Over time, bonds began to form, not only among the German women themselves, but also with the guards in small indirect ways. A smile, a nod, a patient explanation of a routine rule. These moments were small, almost imperceptible, yet they carried immense weight. Trust was tentative, fragile, and slow to develop. One journal entry read, "I watched her smile at me as she handed me clean clothes. I wanted to look away, to refuse it. Yet I took them, and it felt like a betrayal to accept kindness from the enemy." Letters and diaries also revealed the lingering fear of judgment back home. They knew that their experience, if shared, would be scrutinized, criticized, or misunderstood. One wrote, "I cannot tell anyone how it is here. They will not believe that we are fed, that we sleep warmly, that we are treated kindly. They expect horror. They will not understand calm." As weeks passed, subtle routines became entrenched. The women began to understand the layout of the camp, the schedule of meals, the quiet authority of the guards. Yet the psychological impact remained profound. Each small act of normalcy, a meal, a walk, a conversation, was both comforting and disorienting. They were learning a new language of survival, one based not on fear, but on observation, patience, and adaptation. One woman described the experience in a simple yet powerful sentence. "We arrived thinking we knew fear, but this was different. Fear was silent. Fear was waiting for us to forget it, to trust, to see the world as it is, not as we were told." By the end of the first month in Britain, the women had not just survived, they had begun to understand the strange paradoxical reality of captivity. They were prisoners, yet treated with humanity. They were surrounded by rules, yet those rules existed in calm, predictable patterns. They were young women in a foreign land, yet slowly, carefully, they adapted. The shock of expectation versus reality never fully disappeared. Each day brought reminders of what they had left behind, what they feared, and what they were learning. Letters to family contained both relief and caution. Diaries recorded silent awe, quiet reflection, and slow understanding. They were living in a world that was neither war nor freedom, neither punishment nor comfort, but something entirely in between. As the weeks turned into months, the women settled into a fragile equilibrium. They worked, they ate, they slept, and they observed. Their thoughts remained alert, their minds carefully measuring every detail. And yet, beneath this routine, the slow, transformative experience continued. The realization that human life, even in captivity, could exist with dignity, calm, and unexpected care. The story of these German female POWs in Britain is not one of dramatic battles or heroic escapes. It is a story of quiet shock, of disbelief, and of the mind learning to adjust to a reality far removed from expectation. It is a story of patience, of observation, and of the subtle, profound ways humans respond to kindness, order, and calm in the midst of uncertainty. By the end of their first months, these young women had learned a lesson far more difficult than any military maneuver, that the human mind, shaped by fear and propaganda, can be unprepared for calm. That survival is not always about strength or cunning, but about endurance, reflection, and the careful navigation of a world that defies expectation. In the silence of their dormitories, in the quiet of routine meals, in the measured pace of camp life, they experienced a transformation that would remain with them long after the war ended. They had arrived expecting terror. They found something stranger, something harder to understand, the unexpected humanity of their captors. And in that space of quiet observation, the real story of captivity, shock, and adaptation unfolded.